He never expected that a simple trip to his old courthouse would end in a confrontation that would shock an entire town. The disrespectful laughter echoing through the parking lot was about to transform into dead silence when these bikers discovered exactly who they had chosen to threaten. Before you go on, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. You won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, it's going to leave you speechless. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse parking lot in Millbrook, a modest city where justice moved as slowly as the changing seasons. Richard Sterling, a retired judge with steel grey hair and eyes that had seen through countless lies, walked steadily toward his car. At 72, he still carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had commanded respect in his courtroom for over 3 decades. The courthouse, a towering structure of weathered limestone and marble columns, had been his second home for most of his career. Even now, 2 years into retirement, he found himself drawn back to these grounds, often visiting his former colleagues or providing guidance to younger judges who sought his counsel. Today had been no different. A routine visit to help a former clerk with a particularly complex case. The parking lot was nearly empty, most of the court staff and visitors having left for the day. Only a few cars remained, their surfaces gleaming. In the golden hour light, Richard adjusted his tie, a habit he'd never managed to break even after leaving the bench. His briefcase, worn but well-maintained like its owner, swung gently at his side. The peaceful atmosphere was suddenly shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycles. The sound echoed off the courthouse walls, amplifying as 3 bikes tore into the parking lot, their engines deliberately revving louder than necessary. The riders, members of a local motorcycle gang called the Steel Serpents, circled the lot before coming to a stop near the courthouse steps. Richard paused, watching as the bikers dismounted. Their leather vests bore patches that marked them as part of the notorious group known for causing trouble throughout the county. The leader, a muscular man with a shaved head and a beard streaked with grey, caught sight of Richard and nudged his companions. "Well, look what we got here," the leader called out, his voice carrying across the lot. "Some fancy suit who thinks he owns the place." The other 2 bikers laughed, the sound harsh and mocking in the evening air. Richard continued walking, his pace unhurried. He'd seen enough troublemakers in his time to know that showing fear only encouraged them. But as he approached his car, the bikers moved to intercept him, their boots scraping against the asphalt as they spread out to block his path. "Hey, old-timer," the leader said, stepping closer. "You look like one of them courthouse types, the kind that thinks they're better than everyone else." His breath reeked of cigarettes and cheap whiskey, his eyes narrowed with contempt. The other 2 bikers flanked their leader, both younger men with matching sneers. One wore a bandana covered in skulls, while the other had a chain wrapped around, his fist like a makeshift weapon. They were clearly trying to intimidate Richard, expecting him to cower like most people did when confronted by the Steel Serpents. But Richard Sterling didn't flinch. He'd stared down hardened criminals, heard testimonies that would make most people's blood run cold, and delivered sentences that had changed lives forever. These men, with their practiced intimidation and theatrical displays of toughness, were nothing compared to what he'd faced in his career. "Gentlemen," Richard said, his voice calm and measured, carrying the same authority it had held in his courtroom, "I suggest you step aside." The words were simple, but they held a weight that made one of the younger bikers shift uncomfortably. The leader, however, wasn't so easily deterred. He stepped even closer, now just inches from Richard's face. "Or what, old man? You gonna call the cops? Maybe cry to your rich friends inside?" He gestured toward the courthouse with a dismissive wave. What the bikers couldn't know, what no one who hadn't served in Richard's courtroom would understand, was that they weren't dealing with just any retired judge. They were about to learn that some people earn respect not through intimidation, but through years of unwavering dedication to justice. And as the tension in the parking lot grew thicker, the true nature of Richard Sterling's character was about to be revealed in a way that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. The sun continued its descent, casting longer shadows. Across the courthouse steps and in the growing darkness, something in Richard's eyes changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in that moment the air seemed to grow heavier with the weight of what was about to unfold. The bikers had no idea that their attempt at intimidation was about to backfire in a way they could never have anticipated. The early evening sky painted the city of Millbrook in shades of amber and gold, the fading sunlight glinting off the courthouse windows like distant flames. The building itself stood as a testament to justice, its classical architecture a reminder of the weight of law that had governed this city for generations. Richard Sterling knew every inch of this place, from the worn marble steps to the creaking wooden benches in courtroom 3, where he had presided for so many years. Inside his chest, his heart beat steadily, unaffected by the bikers' attempts at intimidation. He had spent too many years behind the bench, seen too many genuine threats, to be rattled by theatrical displays of machismo. His fingers remained relaxed around the handle of his briefcase, his breathing calm and measured, just as it had been. During the most challenging cases of his career, the leader of the Steel Serpents, who had introduced himself with a sneer as Razor, continued to posture, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the pavement. His leather vest was adorned with patches that told stories of violence and defiance of authority, each one a badge of honor in his world. The other two bikers, younger and more restless, shifted their weight from foot to foot, feeding off their leader's confrontational energy. "You courthouse types," Razor spat, circling Richard like a predator sizing up its prey. "Always looking down on everyone else from your fancy benches. Think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" His boots scraped against the asphalt, the sound sharp in the evening quiet. Richard observed them with the same careful attention he had given to countless witnesses in his courtroom. The youngest of the three, barely in his 20s, kept glancing toward the courthouse doors, as if expecting security to emerge at any moment. The middle one, with a serpent tattoo crawling up his neck, gripped his chain tighter, his knuckles white with anticipation. The parking lot had emptied now, the last. Few cars pulling away, their drivers either oblivious to the confrontation or choosing not to get involved. The security guards had already changed shifts, and the night watch wouldn't start their rounds for another hour. Richard knew they were alone, but this knowledge didn't concern him. He had faced far worse situations with the same unflappable composure. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak trees that lined the courthouse grounds, their branches casting shifting shadows across the scene. The same trees had witnessed decades of legal proceedings, celebrations, and confrontations. They had been here when Richard first arrived as a young attorney, full of ideals and determination, and they had watched as he rose through the ranks to become one of the most respected judges in the state's history. "You know," Richard said finally, his voice carrying the same measured tone that had commanded attention in his courtroom for 30 years, "in all my years serving in that building, I've learned one very important thing." He paused, his eyes meeting Razor's with unwavering calm. "True power isn't about intimidation. It's about understanding the consequence of one's actions." Razor laughed, the sound echoing off the courthouse walls. "Listen to this guy, boys, trying to give us a lecture like we're in his precious courtroom." He took another step closer, his massive frame towering over Richard. "But we're not in your courtroom now, are we, Your Honor?" The way he said "Your Honor" dripped with sarcasm, meant to mock and diminish. But Richard didn't react. He had heard far worse from defendants who had stood before him, their futures hanging in the balance. He had learned long ago that maintaining composure was often more powerful than any show of force. The youngest biker, emboldened by his leader's mockery, stepped forward. "Maybe we should show him what real power looks like, Razor. Teach him what happens out here in the real world." His hand moved to his back pocket, where the outline of something solid was visible beneath his jeans. Richard noted the movement, but didn't flinch. His years on the bench had taught him to read people, to see past their bravado to the truth beneath. And what he saw in these three was not the hardened criminals they pretended to be, but rather men desperate to prove their worth through intimidation and violence. The sun had nearly set now, the courthouse's shadow stretching across the parking lot like a giant sundial, marking the approaching darkness. The temperature had begun to drop, but none of the men seemed to notice. The tension in the air had created its own kind of heat, a pressure that built with each passing moment. A distant siren wailed somewhere in the city, its echo bouncing off the buildings before fading into silence. For a brief moment, all four men stood perfectly still, like actors frozen on a stage before the next act of a play. But this was no performance, and what would happen next would have very real consequences for everyone involved. Richard Sterling's carefully pressed suit and polished Oxford shoes seemed almost defiantly out of place in the growing confrontation. His silver hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and though he stood at least 6 inches shorter than Razor, his presence commanded attention. The weight of his years on the bench had shaped him into someone who understood power in its truest form, not the kind that came from physical intimidation or loud motorcycles, but the kind that emanated from unwavering principle. Throughout his career, Richard had earned a reputation for being one of the fairest judges in Millbrook's history. His sentences were firm but just, his judgments carefully weighed against both the letter of the law and the complexity of human nature. He had seen countless men and women stand before him, some hardened criminals, others good people who had made terrible mistakes. Each case had taught him something about human nature, about the thin line between justice and revenge. The courthouse loomed behind them, its weathered stone facade a silent witness to the unfolding scene. Richard had spent countless hours within those walls, carefully considering evidence, listening to testimonies, and delivering verdicts that had changed lives forever. The building had become more than just his workplace. It had been the arena, where he had fought his own battles for justice, often facing pressure from all sides to bend the rules or look the other way. "You think standing there all quiet makes you tough?" Razor growled, his patience wearing thin with Richard's calm demeanor. "I've known guys who've gone through your courtroom, real hard cases. They told me all about you, Sterling, the judge, who always played by the rules." He spat the last words like they were poison. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of his name. So they knew who he was, or at least thought they did. The younger bikers exchanged glances, perhaps realizing for the first time exactly who they were confronting. But Razor pressed on, either oblivious to or unconcerned by this revelation. "You sent some of our brothers away," Razor continued, his voice growing harder. "Gave them maximum sentences when they could have gotten deals. You think that makes you some kind of hero? Standing up there in your black robe, looking down on everyone else?" The retired judge adjusted his grip on his briefcase, not in fear but in preparation. His movements were deliberate, measured, just as they had been when he handled the most sensitive cases in his career. "Every sentence I handed down was based on evidence and law," he replied, his voice steady and clear. "Justice isn't about popularity contests or making friends." The youngest biker, who couldn't have been more than 25, shifted uncomfortably. Something in Richard's demeanor had begun to affect him, causing doubt to creep into his earlier bravado. But the one with the serpent tattoo stepped closer, his chain now wrapped tightly around his fist. "Justice?" he sneered. You call it justice when you lock someone up for 20 years over a couple of mistakes, when you tear families apart with your fancy words and your self-righteous speeches. Richard had heard these arguments before, countless times in his courtroom. He had seen the anger, the resentment, the blame in the eyes of those who stood before him, but he had never wavered from his principles, never let emotion cloud his judgment of the facts. "Every person who appeared in my courtroom had choices," Richard responded, his voice carrying the same authority it had held from the bench. "They chose their actions, and with those actions came consequences. That's not just the law. It's the foundation of a civilized society." A cool evening breeze swept through the parking lot, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees and carrying with it the distant sounds of city traffic. The sun had almost completely set now, the courthouse's security lights beginning to flicker, on one by one, casting harsh shadows across the faces of all four men. Razor took another step forward, his massive frame blocking out the light from one of the lampposts. "Well, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "looks like you've got a choice to make right now. See, we've got some unfinished business with the court system, and you just might be the perfect person to help us settle it." The threat in his words was unmistakable, but Richard remained unmoved. In his years on the bench, he had faced down hardened criminals, received death threats, and even had to be placed under police protection during particularly sensitive cases. But he had never backed down, never compromised his principles. What these bikers couldn't know, what no one except those closest to him understood, was that Richard Sterling's commitment to justice went far deeper than his role as a judge. His past held experiences that had shaped him into someone who understood the true meaning of courage and integrity, someone who knew that standing up for what was right often came at a personal cost. The tension in the courthouse parking lot reached a breaking point as Razor's patience began to wear thin. His initial amusement at finding what he thought was an easy target had transformed into frustration at Richard's unwavering composure. The security lights cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines of anger that had begun to form. "There, maybe you're not hearing me clearly, Your Honor," Razor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, crumpled and worn at the edges. "See this? This is a transcript from one of your cases, the State versus Marcus Reynolds. Ring any bells?" Richard's expression remained neutral, but his mind immediately recalled the case. Marcus Reynolds, a member of the Steel Serpents, had been convicted of assault and intimidation 3 years ago. It had been one of Richard's last cases before retirement, and one that had drawn considerable attention due to the defendant's connections to organized crime. That case was decided based on evidence and testimony, Richard replied, his voice steady. "Mr. Reynolds had a fair trial and competent legal representation." Razor's face twisted into a snarl. "Fair trial? You gave him 15 years, a man with a family, with kids." He took another aggressive step forward, thrusting the paper toward Richard's face. "And now you're going to help us make it right." The other two bikers moved to flank Richard, cutting off his path to his car. The one with the serpent tattoo unraveled the chain from his fist, letting it dangle menacingly at his side. The younger one's hand remained near his back pocket, his fingers twitching nervously. "We've got friends in the clerk's office," Razor continued, his voice low and threatening. "They can make paperwork disappear, create new documents. All we need is a judge's signature. Your signature." He pulled out a pen and held it out to Richard. "Sign this appeal, right here, right now, and we all go home happy." Richard looked at the pen, then back at Razor. In his 30 years on the bench, he had faced numerous attempts at manipulation, bribery, and coercion. Each time his response had been the same. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. Razor's face darkened. "Wrong answer, old man. He nodded to his companions, who stepped closer, their intentions clear. "Maybe we need to help you understand the situation better. See, we're not asking anymore." The younger biker finally pulled the object from his back pocket. A switchblade that gleamed in the security lights. The sound of its blade clicking open echoed across the empty parking lot. "Last chance, Your Honor," he said, trying to sound tough despite the slight tremor in his voice. But Richard didn't back down. Instead, he set his briefcase carefully on the ground and straightened his tie, a gesture that seemed so out of place in the moment that it momentarily confused his would-be attackers. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "In my career," Richard said, his voice carrying the same authority it had held in his courtroom, "I've learned that there are two types of power. The kind that comes from fear and intimidation, which is what you're attempting now, and the kind that comes from unwavering dedication to principle. One is temporary, fleeting. The other—" he paused, his eyes meeting Razor's. "The other is unshakable." Razor's patience snapped. "Enough with the lectures." He lunged forward, grabbing Richard's lapel with his meaty fist. "You're going to sign that appeal, or things are going to get really ugly, really fast." But as Razor's hand made contact with Richard's suit, something changed in the retired judge's demeanor. His eyes, which had been calm and observant, suddenly sharpened with a focus that made even Razor hesitate. It was a look that spoke of experiences far beyond the courtroom, of challenges faced and overcome long before he had ever put on a judge's robe. What the bikers couldn't know was that Richard, Sterling's path to the bench had been anything but typical. Before he had ever picked up a gavel, before he had even considered law school, he had served his country in ways that had taught him about justice in its rawest form. The calm demeanor that had made him an excellent judge wasn't just the product of legal training. It was forged in circumstances that had tested not just his principles, but his very survival. The security lights cast long shadows across the parking lot as the confrontation reached its tipping point. Richard's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a change so subtle that only someone trained to notice such details would have caught it. But in that slight adjustment, years of training and experience were about to make themselves known in a way that would leave these bikers questioning everything they thought they knew about the quiet, dignified judge they had chosen to threaten. What the bikers couldn't have known about Richard Sterling was that before he had ever stepped foot in law school, before he had even considered becoming a judge, he had served as one of the most respected hostage negotiators in the FBI's critical incident response group. For 15 years, he had handled some of the most volatile situations imaginable, where lives hung in the balance and split-second decisions could mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. His career in the FBI had taught him more than just negotiation tactics. It had instilled in him a deep understanding of human psychology, crisis management, and the delicate art of de-escalation. Every case he handled, every standoff he resolved, had shaped him into someone who could read situations and people with an almost uncanny precision. The parking lot confrontation was bringing back memories of countless scenarios he had faced. The way Razor held himself, the nervous energy of the younger biker, the calculated aggression of the one with the chain, these were all patterns he had seen before, behaviors he had studied and understood in ways that went far beyond simple observation. Richard's years in the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Unit had placed him in situations far more dangerous than this one. He had talked down armed terrorists, reasoned with desperate criminals, and navigated complex hostage situations where one wrong word could have meant disaster. Those experiences had taught him that true power often lay not in physical force, but in understanding the psychological dynamics at play. During his time with the Bureau, he had developed a reputation for being able to diffuse even the most volatile situations without violence. His colleagues had nicknamed him the Crane, patient still and capable of striking with precision when necessary. It was an approach he had carried with him to the bench, though few who appeared before him ever knew about his previous career. Years of training were evident in the way he stood now, his stance balanced and ready despite his age. His breathing remained controlled, his mind clear as he assessed the situation with the same methodical approach he had used countless times. Before, the bikers had made a crucial mistake in assuming that his calm demeanor was a sign of weakness rather than the product of years of high-stakes experience. In one particular case that had shaped his career, Richard had spent 48 hours negotiating with a group of armed extremists who had taken over a federal building. The situation had seemed impossible. The militants were well-armed, highly trained, and absolutely convinced of their cause. But Richard had managed to resolve the crisis without a single shot being fired, simply by understanding the psychological triggers at play and knowing exactly when to push and when to pull back. That experience had taught him a valuable lesson that he carried with him throughout his career as a judge. Behind every act of aggression was a story, a motivation that, if understood properly, could be the key to resolution. As he faced down these bikers now, he was already analyzing their dynamics, reading their body language, looking for the tells that would help him navigate this confrontation. "Mr. Reynolds's case," Richard said calmly, even as Razor's grip remained tight on his lapel, "was about more than just assault charges, wasn't it?" His voice carried the same measured tone he had used countless times in crisis situations. "It was about loyalty, about showing strength for your organization. I understand that better than you might think." Razor's grip loosened slightly, caught off guard by this unexpected response. The other two bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their aggressive posturing momentarily disrupted by Richard's calm analysis of their motivations. "But what you're doing right now," Richard continued, his eyes locked with Razor's, "isn't about loyalty. It's about fear. Fear of appearing weak, fear of losing control. I've seen it before many times, in situations far more desperate than this one." Something in his voice, in the authority and understanding it carried, made even Razor take half a step back. It wasn't the voice of a judge lecturing from the bench. It was the voice of someone who had stared into the abyss of human conflict and emerged with a deeper understanding of what drove people to their breaking points. The security lights continued to cast their harsh glow over the scene, but the dynamics had shifted. The aggressive energy that had dominated the confrontation was beginning to give way to something else: uncertainty, confusion, and perhaps even a grudging respect for the man they had mistaken for an easy target. What they didn't realize was that Richard Sterling's understanding of conflict resolution went far beyond his years on the bench. His time in the FBI had taught him that every confrontation was a complex dance of psychology, timing, and control. And as he stood there in the courthouse parking lot, those lessons were about to prove their worth once again. The tension in the parking lot reached a critical point as Razor processed Richard's words. The biker leader's face contorted with a mix of confusion and growing anger, his grip tightening once again on Richard's lapel. The other two bikers moved closer, their earlier uncertainty giving way to a renewed sense of aggression. "You think you understand us?" Razor snarled, his face inches from Richard's. "You think a few fancy words about fear and loyalty make you some kind of expert? Let me show you what real fear looks like, old man." He pulled back his free hand, forming it into a fist. But before he could strike, Richard's voice cut through. The air, with a sharp, commanding tone that he had developed during countless hostage negotiations. "Like the fear you felt when your brother died in that prison riot last year?" The words hit Razor like a physical blow, causing him to freeze mid-motion. "How did you—" Razor's voice trailed off, his expression shifting from anger to shock. "Marcus, Reynolds wasn't just any member of your gang," Richard continued, his voice steady and controlled. "He was there when it happened. He tried to save your brother's life. That's why this case means so much to you. That's why you're here." The younger biker's knife wavered slightly as he watched his leader's reaction. The one with the chain took a half step back, clearly unsettled by this unexpected turn in the confrontation. Richard's detailed knowledge of their personal history had thrown them off balance, just as he had intended. "I remember every detail of that case," Richard went on, maintaining eye contact with Razor, including the parts that never made it into the official record. The conversations that happened in my chambers, the details that were kept out of the proceedings to protect certain individuals. Razor's grip on Richard's lapel loosened slightly, his expression now a complex mixture of anger, grief, and confusion. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Your brother, James Mitchell," Richard said softly, using the real name rather than the gang moniker. "He was trying to prevent the riot. He was working with the prison authorities to keep the peace. That's not something widely known, is it? But it's why you're really angry, not because Marcus got 15 years, but because the full story was never told." The security lights cast stark shadows across Razor's face as the truth of Richard's words sank in. The other two bikers had backed away slightly, their aggressive posturing forgotten as they watched their leader struggle with memories he'd tried to bury during the case. Richard continued, his voice taking on the same tone he had used in countless crisis negotiations. "Marcus chose not to reveal that information. He knew it would put your brother's reputation at risk within the gang. He chose to protect James's memory, even if it meant a longer sentence." The chain-wielding biker lowered his weapon, his earlier bravado replaced by a look of surprised recognition. "That's why Marcus never appealed," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "He was protecting the boss's brother's reputation." Richard nodded slowly. "The law requires justice, but justice doesn't always mean the whole truth has to become public record. Sometimes protecting someone's memory is more important than a reduced sentence." Marcus understood that. "I thought you did too." Razor's hand finally released Richard's lapel, falling limply to his side. The parking lot fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the soft hum of the security lights. The aggressive energy that had filled the space just moments before had transformed into something more complex, more human. "All these years," Razor said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I blamed the system, blamed you, but Marcus—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the realization of his friend's sacrifice finally hitting home. The younger biker had put away his knife, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the whole situation. The one with the chain had retreated further, the weapon now hanging uselessly at his side. They were no longer facing down a retired judge. They were witnessing a truth they hadn't been prepared to confront. Richard straightened his tie, a gesture that seemed to carry more weight now than it had earlier. "Marcus Reynolds made a choice," he said firmly. "He chose loyalty over leniency. That's something your brotherhood claims to value above all else, isn't it?" The transformation in the parking lot was palpable. The three bikers who had arrived, full of menace and bravado, now stood silent, their threatening postures replaced by something that looked almost like respect. Richard's understanding of their world, his knowledge of their personal histories, had completely shifted the dynamic of the confrontation. What they didn't realize was that this kind of psychological turning point was exactly what Richard had been trained to achieve during his years as a negotiator. He knew that true de-escalation often required more than just calm words. It required touching the human core beneath the aggressive exterior. Long before Richard Sterling had ever donned a judge's robe, before he had mastered the art of hostage negotiation, His path had been shaped by experiences that had tested every fiber of his being. His journey began in 1975, fresh out of college, when he joined the FBI Academy at Quantico. The young Sterling had been driven by an unwavering desire to serve justice, but what he found was a calling that would define his entire approach to conflict resolution. The Academy had immediately recognized something special in Sterling. While other trainees excelled in physical combat or marksmanship, Sterling showed an extraordinary ability to read people and situations. His instructors noted his exceptional calm under pressure, his ability to maintain clarity in chaos, and most importantly, his talent for understanding the psychological dynamics of critical situations. It was during his third year as a field agent that Sterling faced a case that would change his life forever. A desperate father had taken an entire elementary school hostage, demanding to see his children who had been removed from his custody. The situation was volatile, with local law enforcement ready to storm the building. But Sterling, still a relatively junior agent, saw something in the man's behavior that others had missed. Against protocol, he requested to negotiate directly with the hostage taker. For 14 hours, Sterling talked with the man, not just about his demands, but about his fears, his pain, and his deep sense of loss. In the end, the situation was resolved without a single casualty. The incident caught the attention of the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, and Sterling was recruited into their elite ranks. Over the next 15 years, Sterling became one of the Bureau's most effective negotiators. His approach was unique. He didn't just talk to people, he understood them. He had an almost uncanny ability to see past the surface aggression and touch the human core beneath. His colleagues would often say that Sterling could read a person's life story in their stance, their tone, their choice of words. There was the case in '83, when he talked down an armed militia group in Montana. The standoff had lasted 5 days, with temperatures dropping below freezing. Sterling had stood in the snow, hour after hour, building a rapport with the group's leader. He learned about their grievances, their fears, their sense of betrayal by the system. In the end, they surrendered peacefully, not because they were defeated, but because Sterling had helped them find a way to be heard without violence. Or the time in '87, when he negotiated with bank robbers who had taken 16 hostages in downtown Chicago. The situation seemed hopeless. The robbers were ex-military, well-trained, and seemingly ready to die. But Sterling had seen something in their behavior, a pattern that spoke of deeper motivations. He discovered that their leader was trying to pay for his daughter's medical treatment. Sterling worked with the prosecutors to ensure that this context was considered in their sentencing, effectively turning a potential bloodbath into a pathway toward justice tempered with mercy. These experiences had taught Sterling that true authority didn't come from a badge or a title. It came from understanding human nature in all its complexity. He learned that behind every act of aggression was a story of pain, fear, or desperation. This understanding had served him well when he later transitioned to the judiciary, though few who appeared before him ever knew about his past. The case that had finally pushed him toward becoming a judge had come in 1990. A hostage situation in the federal courthouse had turned critical, with an armed defendant holding his own attorney at gunpoint. Sterling had been called in to negotiate, and as he worked to resolve the situation, he found himself increasingly drawn to the legal system's potential for preventing such desperate acts rather than just responding to them. He had seen how the system could fail people, how it could push them to desperate measures. But he had also seen how it could serve justice when administered with wisdom and understanding. After that incident, Sterling enrolled in law school, attending night classes while still serving with the FBI. His unique background made him an unconventional but highly effective student, one who understood both the letter and the human cost of the law. Throughout his legal career, Sterling had maintained the same approach that had made him an exceptional negotiator. Whether dealing with hardened criminals or first-time offenders, he always looked for the story behind the crime, the human element that could lead to true justice rather than mere punishment. His reputation for fairness on the bench was built on this foundation of understanding human nature. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike knew that in Sterling's courtroom, every case would be heard with not just legal expertise, but with a deep understanding of the human factors involved. His sentences were firm but fair, always taking into account the full context of the situation. Now, as he stood in the courthouse parking lot, facing down 3 angry bikers, all of those years of experience were coming into play. The same skills that had helped him diffuse countless hostile situations were now helping him read the subtle shifts in the bikers' behavior, the hidden motivations behind their aggression, and most importantly, the path to resolving this confrontation without violence. The tension in the parking lot had reached its peak, the air crackling with the weight of revelation and barely contained emotion. Razor stood frozen, his earlier aggression replaced by a complex mixture of grief and understanding. The truth about his brother's death and Marcus Reynolds' sacrifice had stripped away the protective layer of anger he had worn for so long. This time, Razor said, his voice hoarse with emotion, I've been blaming the wrong person. His massive frame seemed to deflate slightly, the years of carrying his misplaced vengeance suddenly visible in the slump of his shoulders. Richard maintained his steady gaze, drawing upon decades of experience in handling critical moments like this. He knew that this was the most delicate part of any confrontation, the moment when reality finally breaks through the walls of denial and anger. One wrong word now could shatter the progress they'd made. Your brother was a good man, Richard said softly, but with conviction. He tried to prevent bloodshed, tried to maintain peace even at great personal risk. Marcus honored that sacrifice in his own way. Sometimes the greatest acts of loyalty are the ones that remain unspoken. The younger biker had completely lowered, his knife now, slipping it back into his pocket with trembling hands. The one with the chain had let it drop to his side, the metal links clinking softly against the asphalt. The security lights cast long shadows across their faces, highlighting the transformation taking place. But the 15 years, Razor struggled to maintain his remaining anger, though it was clearly slipping away. Why such a harsh sentence if you understood all this? Richard took a careful step forward, no longer concerned about the biker's potential for violence. Because Marcus himself requested it, he revealed, his voice carrying the weight of this long-held secret. In my chambers, off the record, he told me he needed a sentence heavy enough to prevent any suspicion about deals or cooperation. He was protecting your brother's memory until the end. The parking lot fell silent as the full impact of this revelation sank in. The younger bikers exchanged glances, their worldview visibly shifting as they processed this new understanding of loyalty and sacrifice. I don't understand. The one with the chain finally spoke, his voice uncertain. Why didn't Marcus tell us? Why keep this hidden for so long? Richard turned his attention to him, recognizing the genuine confusion in his voice. Because true loyalty isn't about what people know you've done. It's about what you're willing to do without recognition or reward. Marcus understood that better than most. Razor's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his internal struggle visible in every movement. The tough exterior he'd maintained for years was crumbling, revealing the pain and guilt he'd been carrying since his brother's death. I came here tonight wanting revenge, Razor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Thought I was standing up for a brother who'd been wronged by the system. But all this time, he couldn't finish the sentence, emotion choking off his words. Richard moved closer, his presence now comforting rather than confrontational. Your brother's death wasn't in vain, he said firmly. He died trying to prevent violence, trying to maintain peace. The question now is, how will you honor that legacy? The security lights flickered briefly, casting momentary shadows across the scene. In that brief darkness, something shifted in the atmosphere of the confrontation. When the lights stabilized, the three bikers stood differently, their aggressive postures completely abandoned. "I've been leading them wrong," Razor said, gesturing to his younger companions. "Teaching them that strength only comes through fear and violence, but James, he knew better than that." The younger bikers watched their leader with a mixture of confusion and respect. They had never seen this side of him, never witnessed such vulnerability from the man they had followed without question. "It's never too late to change course," Richard offered, drawing upon his years of experience in both negotiation and justice. "Your brother believed in peace, in preventing unnecessary violence. Marcus understood that and chose to honor it with his silence. Now you have the same choice to make." Razor looked up at the courthouse, its imposing structure now seeming less like a symbol of oppression and more like a testament to the complex nature of justice and loyalty. The anger that had driven him to this confrontation had been transformed into something else: understanding, regret, and perhaps even the beginning of wisdom. "I've been carrying this anger for so long," Razor admitted, meeting Richard's eyes. "Blaming everyone else, never stopping to think about what James would have wanted, what he died trying to prevent." The transformation in the parking lot was complete. Where there had been three threatening figures intent on intimidation and violence, now stood three men grappling with truths that had shaken their fundamental beliefs about loyalty, justice, and strength. Richard watched as the realization continued to spread across Razor's face, years of misplaced anger and resentment, giving way to understanding. The security lights cast a harsh glow over the scene, highlighting the profound transformation taking place in the courthouse parking lot. "I need to tell you something else about your brother," Richard said, his voice carrying the same measured tone he had used countless times in crisis negotiations. "There was a letter. James wrote it just days before the riot, addressing it to the prison warden. I've kept its contents confidential all these years, but I think it's time you knew." Razor's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. The other two bikers moved closer, drawn by this new revelation. The chain lay forgotten on the ground, the earlier threats of violence now seeming distant and foolish. "What letter?" Razor's voice cracked slightly. "What did he say?" Richard reached into his briefcase, his movements deliberate and calm. He pulled out a worn folder, its edges softened by years of handling. "I kept a copy," he explained. "Not in the official records, but in my personal files. I always knew there might come a day when the truth needed to be told." He opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, its creases showing how many times it had been folded and unfolded over the years. "Your brother wrote, 'I know what I'm doing might look like betrayal to my brothers on the outside, but sometimes being loyal means standing against violence, even when it comes from your own family. If anything happens to me, I want it known that I chose this path not out of weakness, but out of strength.'" Razor's massive frame seemed to sway slightly as the words hit him. The younger biker reached out to steady him, their earlier aggression completely forgotten. The one who had wielded the chain moved closer, his face showing a mix of awe and shame. "James wasn't just trying to prevent a riot," Richard continued, his voice gentle but firm. "He was trying to change the whole culture of violence. He believed that true strength came from protecting others, not from intimidation and fear. Marcus Reynolds understood that, which is why he chose to protect your brother's legacy, even at the cost of his own freedom." The parking lot fell silent as Razor processed this information. The security lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows. that seemed to stretch into the past, reaching back to decisions and sacrifices that had shaped all their lives. All these years, Razor finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I've been dishonoring his memory. Everything we've done, everything I've led these young men to do, he gestured to his companions. It's been the opposite of what James stood for. The younger bikers shifted uncomfortably, their own perspectives visibly changing as they witnessed their leader's transformation. The one who had held the knife spoke up, his voice uncertain. So what do we do now, boss? How do we make this right? Richard carefully returned the letter to his briefcase, his movements measured and purposeful. Your brother left a legacy, he said, addressing Razor directly. Not one of violence or intimidation, but of courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. The question isn't about making things right. It's about moving forward in a way that honors that legacy. Razor straightened, up something new replacing the anger in his eyes. The Steel Serpents have been heading down the wrong path, he admitted. We've been using fear to command respect, but that's not respect at all, is it? That's just creating more violence, more pain. It's never too late to change direction, Richard offered, drawing upon his years of experience in both crisis negotiation and justice. Your brother understood that. So did Marcus. Now it's your turn to make that choice. The transformation in the parking lot was profound. The three men who had arrived intent on intimidation and violence now stood humbled by the weight of truth and sacrifice. The security lights that had earlier cast menacing shadows now seemed to illuminate a path forward, one that led away from violence and toward something more meaningful. I want to visit Marcus, Razor said suddenly, his voice firm with decision. I need to thank him, to tell him I understand now what he did for my brother's memory. And maybe... He paused, looking at his younger companions. Maybe it's time. We started using our strength to protect instead of threaten, just like James tried to do. Richard nodded, recognizing the sincerity in Razor's words. The hostage negotiator in him knew when a breakthrough was genuine, when someone had truly crossed the threshold from conflict to understanding. This wasn't just about diffusing a dangerous situation anymore. It was about transformation, about honoring sacrifices made years ago. The younger bikers stood straighter, something shifting in their demeanor as they watched their leader choose a new path. The chain lay forgotten on the ground, a symbol of the intimidation tactics they were leaving behind. In its place, something new was emerging, an understanding that true strength lay not in creating fear, but in having the courage to stand for what's right. The night had grown deeper, but the courthouse parking lot remained illuminated by the steady glow of security lights. The tension that had filled the space earlier had transformed into something else entirely, a shared moment of understanding between four men who had started the evening as adversaries, but now stood united by revealed truths and newfound respect. Razor bent down to pick up the chain his companion had dropped, holding it thoughtfully in his massive hands. This isn't what James would have wanted, he said quietly, almost to himself. All this intimidation, the violence, we've been doing it all wrong. Richard watched as the biker leader coiled the chain carefully and handed it back to his companion, the gesture symbolic of the change taking place. The younger bikers stood quietly, their earlier bravado replaced by contemplation as they witnessed their leader's transformation. Your brother left behind more than just memories, Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. He left a blueprint for what the Steel Serpents could be, not a gang that terrorizes communities, but a brotherhood that protects them. The youngest biker, who had wielded the knife earlier, stepped forward hesitantly. Is it true what they say about the prison riots, he asked, that some of the guards survived only because certain inmates protected them? Richard nodded slowly, remembering the details that had never made it into the official reports. "Your brother organized a group of inmates to protect the guards during the worst of the violence," he explained, looking at Razor. He knew that once the violence started, innocent people would be caught in the crossfire. He couldn't let that happen. Razor's face showed a complex mix of pride and pain. "That sounds like James," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "always looking out for others, even when it put him at risk. I just never understood it until now." The security lights flickered briefly, casting momentary shadows that seemed to dance across the courthouse walls. When the lights stabilized, something had shifted in the atmosphere. The three bikers stood differently now, their postures reflecting the weight of their realizations. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Razor continued, addressing Richard, "about Marcus choosing a longer sentence to protect James's memory. That kind of loyalty, that's what we should be about, not this." He gestured vaguely at the parking lot, at the scene of their attempted intimidation. Richard stepped closer, his years of experience in crisis negotiation telling him that this was a crucial moment. "It's never too late to redefine what the Steel Serpents stand for," he said. "Your brother saw the potential for something better. So did Marcus. Now it's your turn to carry that vision forward." The biker with the chains spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "We've got younger members, kids really, looking up to us, following our example. Maybe it's time we showed them a different kind of strength." Razor nodded slowly, his expression hardening with resolve rather than anger. The Steel Serpents were founded on the idea of brotherhood, of looking out for each other. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of what that really means. Richard watched as the transformation continued to unfold. His years in the FBI, and later as a judge, had taught him to recognize genuine change when he saw it. This wasn't just about diffusing a potentially violent situation anymore. It was about witnessing the birth of something new. "Your brother's letter," Razor said suddenly, looking at Richard. "Would it be possible? Could I have a copy? The guys need to know what he really stood for, what he died trying to protect." Richard nodded, reaching into his briefcase once more. "I had a feeling you might ask that," he said, pulling out another copy of the letter. "James's words deserve to be heard, especially by those who follow in his footsteps." As he handed the letter to Razor, their eyes met, and an understanding passed between them. The retired judge and the biker leader, two men who had started the evening as enemies, but now stood connected by their respect for a man who had died trying to prevent violence. The younger bikers moved closer, their curiosity evident as Razor carefully folded the letter and tucked it inside his vest, close to his heart. The gesture wasn't lost on Richard, who had seen countless moments of transformation throughout his career, but few as profound as this. "What happens now?" the youngest biker asked, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty about their new direction. Razor looked up at the courthouse, its imposing structure now seeming less like a symbol of oppression and more like a monument to justice and transformation. "Now," he said firmly, "we honor James's memory the right way. We become the kind of brotherhood he believed in." In the weeks that followed the confrontation in the courthouse parking lot, the city of Millbrook witnessed a transformation that few could have predicted. The Steel Serpents, once known for intimidation and violence, began to change in ways that rippled through the community. The shift wasn't immediate or dramatic. It came in small moments, quiet decisions, and subtle changes that gradually reshaped the gang's reputation. Razor, true to his word, had visited Marcus Reynolds in prison. The meeting, which lasted several hours, had been emotional and transformative for both men. Marcus had finally been able to share the full story of his choice, of how he had protected James's memory even at the cost of his own freedom. The visit had ended with a promise, a commitment to honor James's legacy by transforming the Steel Serpents into something their fallen brother would have been proud of. Richard Sterling had watched these changes unfold from a distance, his years of experience allowing him to appreciate the depth of the transformation taking place. He'd seen the first signs when reports started coming in about Steel Serpents members intervening to prevent violence in their neighborhoods, standing up against drug dealers trying to establish new territory, and even organizing community watch programs. The younger members of the gang, who had once modeled themselves after an image of strength based on fear, were now learning a different kind of power. They began to understand that true respect came not from intimidation, but from standing up for what was right, just as James had done in his final days. One particular incident stood out. A local convenience store owner who had once lived in fear of the Steel Serpents found himself protected by them when a group of out-of-town criminals attempted to rob his store. The bikers had stepped in, not with violence, but with a show of unified strength that made it clear this community was under their protection. "Your brother would be proud," Richard had told Razor during a chance meeting at the courthouse, where the biker leader had come to attend a community outreach program. He saw the potential for this kind of change, even when others couldn't. Razor, his leather vest now bearing a new patch, a serpent encircling a dove, had nodded solemnly. "We're trying to make things right," he'd said. "It's not easy, changing people's perceptions, changing our own habits. But every time I read James's letter, I know we're on the right path." The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by law enforcement either. Officers who had once approached Steel Serpents members with hands on their weapons now found themselves working alongside them to keep peace in the community. The gang's knowledge of the streets, combined with their new commitment to preventing violence, had created an unexpected alliance. The younger biker who had held the knife that night in the parking lot had become one of the most vocal advocates for change. He'd started a program working with at-risk youth, sharing his own story of transformation and teaching them about the true meaning of strength and brotherhood. Even the courthouse itself seemed different now. Where the Steel Serpents had once seen it as a symbol of oppression, they now recognized it as a place where justice could be served, where the principles James had died for could be upheld. Some members had even begun attending court sessions, not as defendants, but as observers, learning about the legal system they had once despised. Richard's role in this transformation hadn't been forgotten. The respect he had earned that night in the parking lot had grown into something deeper, a recognition that true authority came not from fear or power, but from wisdom and understanding. He had become something of an unofficial advisor to the gang, his experience and insight helping guide their transition. "Sometimes," he told them during one of their meetings, "the greatest strength lies not in standing against your enemies, but in standing up for your principles, even when it costs you everything." That's what James understood. That's what Marcus honored. And that's what you're all learning now. The chain that had been meant as a weapon that night lay displayed in Razor's office, a reminder of the path they had left behind. Beside it hung a framed copy of James's letter, its words serving as a daily inspiration for the new direction of the Steel Serpents. The younger members, who had once measured their worth by their ability to intimidate, now found pride in their capacity to protect and serve. They had learned that true brotherhood wasn't about creating fear, but about fostering respect and understanding. The transformation of the Steel Serpents became a story told throughout Millbrook, a testament to the power of truth and redemption. But more than that, it became a living tribute to James's sacrifice, to Marcus's loyalty, and to the wisdom of a retired judge who had seen beyond the surface of anger to the potential for change that lay beneath. As Richard watched this evolution continue, he was reminded of something he had learned long ago during his years as a negotiator, that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from forcing people to submit, but from helping them discover the strength to transform themselves. 6 months. After that fateful night in the courthouse parking lot, Richard Sterling stood at his office window, watching as a line of motorcycles pulled into the parking lot below. The riders, members of the transformed Steel Serpents, were arriving for a community outreach event, a regular occurrence now at the courthouse they had once viewed with such hostility. The sight brought a subtle smile to his face as he reflected on the profound changes that had taken place. The Steel Serpents had become something none of them could have imagined that night, a force for positive change in Millbrook. Their leather vests still commanded attention, but now they garnered respect rather than fear. Today was particularly significant. Marcus Reynolds was being released early. His sentence reduced after a review of his case revealed his role in preventing further violence during his time in prison. The Steel Serpents had gathered not just to welcome him home, but to honor the legacy of brotherhood and protection that had emerged from the truth about James's sacrifice. Razor stood at the head of the group, his massive frame now carrying a different kind of authority. The patch on his vest, the serpent encircling the dove, gleamed in the morning sun. Beside him, the younger members who had once wielded chains and knives now wore expressions of pride and purpose. "Your Honor," Razor called out as Richard approached the group. The title was now spoken with genuine respect rather than mockery. "We wouldn't be here without you. Without that night when you showed us what real strength looks like." Richard shook his head modestly. "You found that strength yourselves," he replied. "I just helped you remember what it looked like. James showed you the way long ago. You just needed to be reminded of his example." The youngest member, now running a successful youth mentoring program, stepped forward. "We've been thinking about James's letter," he said, "about what he wrote about true loyalty, meaning standing against violence. We want to make it official, change our charter to reflect those principles." Richard listened as they outlined their plans for the future. The Steel Serpents were establishing a foundation in James's name, dedicated to preventing youth violence and supporting families affected by gang activity. They had already begun working with other motorcycle clubs, spreading their message of transformation and redemption. "Marcus will be proud to see this," Richard said, looking at the gathered group. "This is what real justice looks like. Not just punishment, but transformation, change that ripples out and affects entire communities." As if on cue, a car pulled up to the courthouse. Marcus Reynolds stepped out, looking older but standing tall. The years in prison hadn't broken him. If anything, they had strengthened his resolve. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. Dozens of Steel Serpents members gathered not for violence, but for celebration. Razor stepped forward first, embracing Marcus with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for protecting my brother's memory, for showing us what real loyalty means." The reunion that followed was more than just a homecoming. It was a testament to the power of truth and redemption. Marcus shared stories of James's final days, of his vision for what the Steel Serpents could become. Each word seemed to strengthen the group's commitment to their new path. Richard watched from the sidelines, his heart full. In all his years as a negotiator and judge, he had seen countless attempts at rehabilitation and reform. But this was different. This was genuine transformation, born from understanding and truth. The courthouse, once a symbol of their defiance, had become a gathering place for their renewal. Regular meetings were now held in its chambers, where Steel Serpents members worked alongside law enforcement and community leaders to address issues facing their city. As the morning progressed, more community members arrived. Shop owners, teachers, parents, all coming to welcome Marcus home and celebrate the changes in their neighborhood. The fear that had once permeated their interactions with the Steel Serpents had been replaced by genuine appreciation and respect. "You know," Marcus said quietly to Richard as they watched the gathering, "when I chose to take that longer sentence, I never imagined it would lead to this. I just wanted to protect James's memory." Richard nodded, understanding. "Sometimes the greatest changes come from the smallest acts of integrity," he replied. "James showed courage in standing against violence. You showed courage in protecting his legacy, and now these men show courage every day by choosing a different path." The transformation of the Steel Serpents had become more than just a local story. It had become a model for other communities dealing with similar issues. Reporters occasionally visited Millbrook, seeking to understand how a confrontation in a courthouse parking lot had led to such profound change. But those who had been there that night knew the truth. It wasn't just about one confrontation or one revelation. It was about the power of understanding, the strength found in honoring true loyalty, and the courage to choose a different path when the truth lights the way. As the sun climbed higher over the courthouse, casting its warm light over the gathered crowd, Richard Sterling knew that this was what real justice looked like. Not just the enforcement of laws, but the transformation of hearts and minds. The Steel Serpents had become living proof that change was possible, that redemption was real, and that the greatest strength often came from choosing to protect rather than harm. 1 year after Marcus Reynolds' release, the city of Millbrook had become a testament to what was possible when true justice met genuine transformation. The Steel Serpent story had spread beyond the city limits, drawing attention from other communities struggling with similar issues. But it was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when the most profound example of their change would unfold. Richard Sterling was presiding over a special ceremony in the courthouse's main hall, not as a judge, but as a witness to something extraordinary. The Steel Serpents had gathered in full force, their leather vests now bearing additional patches that told the story of their transformation. They were there to launch the James Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to preventing youth violence and supporting rehabilitation programs. A year ago, Razor addressed the packed courthouse, his voice carrying to every corner. "We stood in the parking lot outside, thinking we knew what strength meant. We thought it was about fear, about making others submit to our will." He paused, his eyes meeting Richard's. "We couldn't have been more wrong." The audience, a mix of community leaders, law enforcement officials, and local residents, listened intently as Razor continued. Marcus Reynolds stood beside him, now serving as the Foundation's lead counselor, his own experience providing invaluable insight into the rehabilitation process. "My brother James knew something we had forgotten," Razor went on, pulling out the worn letter that had changed everything. He wrote, "The true strength comes from protecting others, from standing against violence, even when it comes from your own family. Today, we're not just honoring his memory, we're living it." The Foundation's first initiative was already showing remarkable results. The younger biker who had once held a knife in the parking lot now led a mentoring program that had helped dozens of at-risk youth find better paths. The one who had wielded the chain had become instrumental in organizing community safety patrols, working alongside local police rather than against them. Richard watched from his seat as various Steel Serpents members shared their stories of transformation. Each account reinforced what he had known that night in the parking lot, that beneath the surface of aggression often lay the potential for profound change. "The hardest part wasn't changing ourselves," one member explained to the gathered crowd. "It was proving to others that the change was real. But Judge Sterling taught us something important that night. Respect isn't taken by force, it's earned through actions." The ceremony took an unexpected turn when local law enforcement presented the Steel Serpents with a Community Service Award. The same officers who had once viewed the group with suspicion now stood alongside them as partners in maintaining peace throughout Millbrook. A year ago, I would have laughed if someone told me I'd be working with the Steel Serpents, Police Chief Davidson admitted during his speech. But they've shown us what real community protection looks like. They've become an essential part of keeping our neighborhoods safe. As the ceremony continued, Richard reflected on how far they had come. The parking lot confrontation that could have ended in violence had instead sparked a transformation that continued to ripple through the community. The Steel Serpents had not only changed themselves, but had become catalysts for change in others. Marcus stepped forward to announce the Foundation's newest initiative, a scholarship program in James's name, designed to help former gang members pursue education and job training. James believed in second chances, he explained, his voice thick with emotion. He believed that everyone had the potential to choose a better path. This foundation exists to make that belief a reality. The courthouse, once a symbol of authority to be defied, had become a center for community healing. Regular meetings between the Steel Serpents, law enforcement, and community leaders were now held in its chambers, focusing on proactive solutions to neighborhood issues. "You know what the real miracle is?" Razor said quietly to Richard during a break in the ceremony. "It's not just that we changed. It's that we helped others see they could change too. Every time we stop a kid from making the mistakes we made, every time we help someone find a better way, that's James's legacy living on." Richard nodded, understanding the depth of what Razor was saying. In his years as both an FBI negotiator and a judge, he had seen countless attempts at reformation. But what made the Steel Serpent's transformation unique was its authenticity. It came from a place of genuine understanding and commitment to change. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new mural on the courthouse wall, a powerful image of a serpent and dove intertwined, surrounded by words from James's letter. It would serve as a daily reminder to everyone who passed by that transformation was possible, that strength could be found in protecting rather than harming others. As the crowd began to disperse, Richard overheard conversations that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Steel Serpents members discussing community projects with business owners, planning youth outreach programs with school administrators, coordinating security efforts with local police. The sun was setting over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, but the light of transformation that had begun in that parking lot continued to shine brightly, illuminating a path forward for anyone willing to choose a different way. 5 years after the night that changed everything, Richard Sterling stood at his old courtroom window, watching as dozens of motorcycles rolled into the courthouse parking lot. The annual James Mitchell Foundation ceremony had grown from a small gathering into a statewide event, drawing reformed gang members, law enforcement officials, and community leaders from across the country. The Steel Serpents, under Razor's leadership, had become a model for gang transformation nationwide. Their story had inspired similar changes in other cities, proving that redemption was possible even in the most hardened environments. The parking lot where their confrontation had taken place now bore a memorial plaque, reminding visitors of the night when understanding trumped violence. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years, Razor's voice came from behind Richard. The biker leader had aged well, his face now carrying the wisdom of his transformation rather than the hardness of his past. "Sometimes I still come here at night, just to remember where it all changed." Richard turned to face him, noting how different Razor looked from that angry man in the parking lot. The Steel Serpent's vest he wore now carried multiple patches, highlighting community service and youth mentorship achievements. "Your brother would be proud," Richard said quietly, "not just of you, but of everything the Steel Serpents have become." The main hall of the courthouse was packed with people gathering for the ceremony. Marcus Reynolds, now the Foundation's executive director, was preparing to announce their most ambitious initiative yet, a nationwide program to help motorcycle clubs transition from violence to community service. We've got representatives from 30 different clubs here today, Marcus explained to Richard as they walked through the crowd. They've all seen what's possible. They want what we've found, real respect, real purpose. The transformation of the Steel Serpents had rippled out in ways none of them could have imagined that night in the parking lot. Their youth mentorship program had expanded to 20 cities, helping hundreds of at-risk teenagers find better paths. The community safety patrols they had initiated had become a model for police-community cooperation. The younger biker who had once held a knife now ran the Foundation's education program, helping former gang members earn their GEDs and pursue college degrees. Judge Sterling showed us that real strength comes from lifting others up, he told the gathered crowd during his speech. Every diploma we help someone earn, every kid we help stay in school, that's real power. The one who had wielded the chain had become the Foundation's outreach coordinator, working directly with other motorcycle clubs looking to change. His personal transformation had become a powerful testimony to what was possible when people chose a different path. Richard listened as speaker after speaker shared stories of how the Steel Serpents example had influenced their own journeys toward change. Police chiefs spoke about decreased gang violence in their cities. Former gang members described how the Foundation had helped them find new purpose. Community leaders detailed the positive impact on their neighborhoods. But none of this would have happened, Razor said during his keynote address, if one man hadn't seen past our anger that night. Judge Sterling didn't just diffuse a confrontation. He showed us a truth about ourselves we had forgotten. He paused, pulling out the worn letter that had started it all. My brother James wrote that true loyalty means standing against violence, even when it comes from your own family. Thanks to Judge Sterling, we finally understood what that meant. The ceremony included the presentation of the first James Mitchell scholarships, awarded to former gang members pursuing careers in law enforcement, social work, and community service. Each recipient shared their story of transformation, echoing the themes of redemption and second chances that had become the Foundation's hallmark. As the day progressed, Richard found himself reflecting on how far they had come. The courthouse that had once been a symbol of authority to be defied had become a center for healing and transformation. The parking lot where threats had been now hosted community gatherings and youth outreach events. You know what amazes me most, Marcus said to Richard during a quiet moment. It's not just that we changed, it's that we found a way to help others change too. Every time someone tells us they want to follow our example, I think about that night in the parking lot, how close we came to choosing a different path. The impact of their transformation had extended far beyond Millbrook. Other cities had begun implementing similar programs, using the Steel Serpents model as a template for their own gang intervention efforts. The Foundation's success had caught the attention of federal agencies, leading to partnerships with national crime prevention programs. Sometimes I wonder, Razor confided in Richard later that evening, what James would think of all this. Us working with the police, helping kids stay out of gangs, teaching other clubs about transformation, it's so far from where we started. Richard smiled, remembering the words from James's letter. He saw this potential in all of you, he replied. He knew that true strength wasn't about creating fear. It was about having the courage to stand up for what's right. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, the gathered crowd began to disperse. But the legacy of that night 5 years ago continued to grow, touching lives far beyond the parking lot where it all began. The Steel Serpents had proven that transformation was possible, that redemption was real, and that the greatest strength often came from choosing to protect rather than harm. Their story had become more than just a local legend. It had become a beacon of hope for communities across the country. Richard watched as the motorcycles rolled out of the parking lot, their engines no longer a sound of intimidation, but a reminder of how far they had come. The plaque on the courthouse wall caught the last rays of sunlight, its words a testament to the power of understanding and the possibility of change. On this spot, anger yielded to wisdom, and true strength was found in the courage to choose a different path. The transformation that had begun in that parking lot continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing communities, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from helping them find the strength to transform themselves. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. Share your thoughts on this remarkable journey of transformation and how it might inspire change in your own community. Remember, real strength isn't about creating fear. It's about having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything.